Hi, everyone, and welcome to Practice Growth HQ. Now, today we're going to talk about maximizing business cycles for record growth. That seems like a big claim, but you'll see in a minute why it's absolutely on the money. And today we're talking to my guest, Steve Anderson. Now, Steve is a business growth expert with decades of experience in the insurance industry. He is the author of the Bezos Letters, a best selling book that breaks down Amazon's success into 14 key principles. Recognized as a top thought leader, Steve is followed by hundreds of thousands and was named one of LinkedIn's most influential voices. So we're lucky to have him on the podcast today, all the way from Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome, Steve.
Angus, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to our conversation.
All right, Steve, we like to start with the fast five, quicker questions, quicker answers, so people can get to know you quickly. Question one, where did you grow up?
Born in Corpus Christi, Texas, moved a couple different places as my dad was changing jobs, and ended up in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., where I graduated high school and came back to after college. So I consider that home.
There you go. Yeah, I lived in the suburbs of DC as well at one point. I was on the Virginia side. All right, question two, favorite book besides your own?
I'd probably have to point to The E-Myth by Michael Gerber, talking about entrepreneurs and having an entrepreneurial seizure, and shaped a lot of my thinking over the years.
Yeah, that's definitely a book that gets a mention on this podcast with some frequency. That might be a hint, listeners. All right,
Yes.
question three. What's one of your superpowers?
Curiosity. I like learning new things. I like figuring out things, and I like improving things, processes, procedures, things like that.
Yes, I must admit, Steve, I sometimes need to apologize to people because I am a fairly curious person as well. And I'll just keep at them going, oh, tell me about this, because I find it so interesting. But some people find it a bit over the top. Question four, something you wish your 20-year-old self knew.
Don't wait to be picked. Really alluding to Seth Godin and some of his writings and thoughts, but step up if you've got a thought and you might be wrong. And that's part of learning also. So
Mm,
don't wait to be picked by somebody.
okay, interesting. And then finally, question five, something you're grateful for.
Oh, I'm grateful for my family. My wife of actually 49 years right now, and
Wow.
2 daughters and 7 grandchildren. They bring great joy to me.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Thank you for that background, Steve. So, we're talking about maximizing business cycles. The listeners may not be familiar with that, but we know from your book, which is called The Bezos Letters.
It is Bezos, by the way,
Is
so
it
you're right.
okay? All right. Bezos, good old Jeff, the founder of Amazon, that started as a book company, I gather, from his garage. And look where we are now. But maximizing business cycles for record growth. What is a business cycle, Steve?
As I was examining the letters to shareholders that he wrote starting in 1997, I realized a couple things. One is there were threads through the letters, and he talked a lot about how they did things at Amazon, not just what they did. And in that, I was able to categorize those principles of growth into 4 cycles. I called them test, build, accelerate, and scale. And I believe every business, whatever it is, be it a practice or a retail store, are continually going through those cycles. They're testing an idea, something new that they come up with. They're building on the success they experience from the test. They're accelerating that growth as they get bigger and scale. How do you get bigger and still maintain that original idea or entrepreneurial excitement when you're going in your practice or going in your office every morning? And I grouped the 14 principles into each of those cycles as one way to help people grasp the whole concept. And as we've talked earlier, 14 is a lot. We never have
Mm,
time to talk about them all,
mm,
but this is one way to help people better understand where they might fit in their own organization.
okay, that's interesting. The truth is, I've read a similar book about Warren Buffett. listeners, for the common person, getting direct access to captains of industry such as Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett, it's not altogether easy. I don't know who you'd need to bribe or blackmail or something, but the one thing that is possible to glean is from their letters to shareholders. And they're forced to do this under the constitution of their companies, and maybe it's just good business. And people like our guest Steve have gone and looked at all of these letters and gone, what are the principles here? Because as the saying goes, success leaves clues. So
Right.
do you feel in some ways like Jeff Bezos?
I think I do, and I think you're right. And I have to say, Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos are the exceptions to the rule of shareholder letters. And the rule of shareholder letters is typically they're boring and they just tout the company. But both of those founders and CEOs talked about how and gave advice.
Mm,
And that's what I thought was just very intriguing. And certainly with Jeff Bezos, how he grew Amazon and the principles and those threads through those letters, I became convinced could help any business. And even as you alluded to, you're never going to get Jeff Bezos as your business coach,
mm.
but this might be the next best thing.
That's great. Well done for doing that. So, what can we learn from Jeff? Maybe go through the business cycles again, and then let's pick up on some of the principles.
Sure. We'll start with test. And again, a new business, you're coming up with ideas. What's going to work? Even in a practice, you're coming up with how do I find customers? How do I treat them well so they come back and they refer me, et cetera.
Mm,
And so the first principle there I call encourage successful failure. And this again comes from Bezos when he said that you have to experiment in order to invent. And by experimenting, that by itself means you're going to fail because if you experiment and you're not failing, you're not experimenting. If you know it's going to work, it's not an experiment.
mm,
So the idea is experiments lead to inventions which allow innovation. So that idea of encouraging employees at the very lowest level to think about how they can improve what's going on in the company, either processes or improve customer experience or improve product, um, and figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work. So and
mm.
that one's I have to say I enjoy that one. It's unusual. You don't normally hear those two words together.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. I was at a conference last week listening, but also speaking, and I spoke about what I call the patient experience because there are many things in healthcare that are difficult to achieve a sustained benefit over competitors. And in other words, I believe I think it was King Solomon who said basically nothing's new under the sun. When in a sense we go, oh wow, that's new, but in many cases the technology may be new, but the principles often you could find books that mention them hundreds of years beforehand. And it's just struck me that when you're looking to stand out in business, you could go, we'll just be cheaper. But in many cases, that just leads to something called a race to the bottom, which nobody wants to do. And then you go, oh, we can provide this service, but it's really only a matter of time until someone else can provide the same service as you. So that experimentation and indeed the patient experience is really one area which is in many ways the hardest thing to copy because you've got to have so many things working together. And as you're alluding to, Steve, a culture of experimentation. So let me ask you this. How does the listener go, hey, let's do a bit of experimentation without feeling we're going to cause a train wreck for some of our patients?
So, with my insurance background, that was the lens I was looking at this through because in insurance, we're really all about reducing risk, mitigating risk, transferring risk,
Mm,
not taking more risk.
mm,
And in today's world, with technology, consumer expectations changing so rapidly, we no longer have the luxury of waiting around to see what's going to work. So, we need to be testing and testing small things first. So this is not doing crazy, stupid stuff. And this is not who cares? This is very intentional, very strategic, and very thoughtful
Hmm.
type of testing. And and even in the customer experience, what are the things that your customers or your patients or your clients experience that are friction points for them? Do
Mm,
you even know?
mm,
And I think that's one of the key ideas that Bezos brought into Amazon, which is really focusing on the customer and what he called customer obsession. And what are those friction points? And for a long time, I will tell you, my experience with medical providers was going in for an appointment and having fill out the same piece of paper every time I went in.
mm.
That's why you already had the information. It's somewhere in a computer. That started to change when iPads and other things where I could see the information, verify what's still current and update what isn't and hand it back. And it's nobody had to do more data entry. It's just an easier experience in that type of situation. So what are those things that you can do? And frankly, most clinicians, most business owners probably don't know what actually happens in that customer cycle experience. I just literally just last week had to go to the ER for some stitches. I mishandled a knife, cut my finger, needed 3
Mm.
stitches, and it was just interesting watching in the ER the whole process of taking care of the customer and their intentional work to keep me informed. Did I need anything? Do I have any questions? And obviously, it hurt, so not a good experience there, but
Mm.
a better experience than I expected in the emergency room.
So what are some areas that the listeners can experiment with?
I would say, again, I'm thinking of practices and clinicians and things like that. What is the experience that customers have? Meaning from setting an appointment all the way to follow up and getting reports. And a couple of the providers that I'm using now are using client portals. After an appointment, I can go in, I get a notification, I can read the summary visit of the doctor's notes
Mm.
and be better informed. And I have even taken, I have to say, those notes, copied them because they're in medicalese. They're not
Yes, yes,
friendly.
yes.
I put them in Chat GPT and said, explain this to a layman.
Huh.
And I get a better explanation that makes more sense to me. And I'm again, there's lots of questions around. I think that could be really interesting, right? To
Mm.
make it an easy way to put it in layman's terms. But even access to that information is new. And if I have an appointment set up, I can do all the pre-visit verifications and updates and all that kind of stuff before I even go to the appointment. So then I walk in, tell them I'm here. They have the information. If there's a couple pieces missing, we fill that in. And again, a much better experience. So I keep going back to make sure you actually understand what the patient is going through and then figure out what you can do. And frankly, there may be some things you can't do yet.
Mm.
And if there are barriers there, regulatory or others, figure out why they're there and maybe help change them. Because
Mm.
again, the patient experience is key.
Yeah, okay, all right. So I would say for the listeners, the key here is really where there's a will, there's a way. If you are determined to do some experimentation because you're taking a leaf out of Jeff Bezos' book and it's you want to be the best or one of the best, then the question is just look through the patient's eyes. What are the things that you see? Steve's alluded to friction points, areas from the patient journey that's maybe not great and go, well, what's something we could try in that space? I'm not suggesting that you necessarily try completely different medical techniques, although I would admit to you that there would be times a lot as healthcare professionals where part of your job is to get patients to do something and maybe they don't want to do it. And so you'd have some opportunities there to experiment. All right, Steve. So we had the test phase. What about the next one? The next phase is the build phase, the build cycle. Tell us about that.
Well, again, in building, and we've talked about this a little bit, but obsess over customers. And again, for Amazon and Bezos, he built that into the culture of the company from the very beginning. And I think what's interesting is just that choice of words. So obsess, that can have
Mm,
negative connotations as well as positive.
mm,
You're too obsessed, maybe, or we know our customers' wants, needs, and desires so deeply that we are able, his phrase, to invent on their behalf. So again, I'm tying some of these together, and that's a part of the process is the principles stand on their own, but they also interact with one another.
mm.
So in the build area, obsess over customers, and maybe a quick second one is apply long-term thinking, meaning Bezos thinks literally generationally. At one point in his letters, he talks about being able to tell his grandchildren about starting Amazon. And this was before he even had kids. So thinking long term into the future, not just short term, what's going to happen the next month or the next quarter. And that's an idea or a principle that I think can be helpful to keep in mind.
Yeah, I would say obsess over customers. I'm going to be really honest. In healthcare, there's not a lot of that. Healthcare as an industry has come out of you need us. You'll come to us on our terms when it's convenient for us. You'll sit in the reception area and wait for when it's convenient for us. And when we see you, Steve's already alluded to this, we'll speak to you in jargon. It's not to say I'm not suggesting for a second that healthcare is not interested in providing good care in terms of your medical needs, but there's a lot of stuff that's been around that space that historically has not been good. And I would say, and this is getting back to my comment earlier in the interview, that patient experience, I would argue, the one sustainable benefit for you over other practices and obsessing over your customers is absolutely heading down that way. I remember, Steve, reading about Jeff Bezos when people had a bad experience, they bought something and it didn't work or didn't arrive. And I gather he's a bit of a tough cookie in some ways. I gather he was screaming at his staff
Yep.
and this sense of, hey, this is not acceptable. Let's get this thing fixed. Why can't we get it fixed right now? And I can remember those messages kind of 10 to 15 years ago. And you look forward to Amazon now. Even in Australia, I live on a farm, Steve. I'm not in metropolitan Melbourne or Sydney. And even for me, ordering stuff off Amazon, like it's amazing how fast it turns up. And that didn't happen by accident. That happened by
No,
obsessing over the customer. And some of those quicker sending stuff out now is relatively normal in the industry, but it wasn't.
it
Uh,
wasn't.
and
That's
that,
right.
and so that's one of the things that they've done. All right.
One comment on that I'm gonna add is when they find a problem or a customer has a problem, he wants that fixed for the customer, but even more important is go back to the procedure that caused the problem
Mm.
and fix that, not just fix the one time, but fix the origination point of the problem. And I think that's a key idea too.
Yeah, and in a healthcare practice, you may not realize, but there would be certainly dozens, if not hundreds of procedures.
Mhm.
Literally, how do we take money? How do we greet someone? How do we clean the floor, etc. And each of those has implications. All right, the next cycle, Steve, is accelerate. We all like the sound of that one.
I think, again, 2 quick ones I'll put in the accelerate. One is called generate high velocity decisions, and that is, all around decision making at Amazon. And real briefly, he describes there are generally 2 types of decisions that a company makes, what he calls type 1 and type 2. Not very creative. Type 1 decisions are really big decisions, like bet the company type decisions. And that those decisions need to be made slowly with lots of data and information and may end up being a gut feel by the top level executives. He says the problem is those decisions are very few and far between.
Mm,
Most decisions at a company are type 2, which are easy decisions to change if you make a wrong. That kind of alludes back to that successful failure. And you should not wait for all the data. You should get at most 70% of what you would like to have. Make a decision, move forward. If you don't like the decision, change it.
Mm,
Either turn around and go back or pivot to something else.
mm,
And he said the type 2 decisions are the most common decisions in a company. When you start adding layers of bureaucracy to get something done, that slows down growth. And that's, again, for him, growth for Amazon was the primary thing they were looking for. The other one, a bit of corollary, but make complexity simple.
mm,
And I will tell you this, the reason that principle came to mind is Amazon a few years ago built a company called PillPack. They were a specialized pharmacy. Their whole thing was targeted to people who took multiple medications.
mm,
They prepackaged the medication by day and time. So if somebody had to take certain medications in the morning, at noon, in the evening, they just opened a package, everything was already there.
mm,
And I remember I was listening in my car to a interview from one of the large pharmacy chain companies here in the US who said, "We're not worried about Amazon coming into the pharmacy space because it's more complex than they realize." And I remember saying out loud, "Yeah, but that's what Amazon does. They
mm,
make complexity simple."
mm,
Your comment earlier about delivery, that is hugely complex.
mm,
And you just said, not didn't use the words, but you just alluded to they've made it simple and expect it.
mm.
So again, what can you do to make complex things as simple as possible?
Now, is that complex procedures within the practice? Is it because sometimes in medical, what you're having to explain to a patient is also complex?
Yes. And are you trained in using layman's language?
Mm,
So
mm,
again, there's this balance. I do get this balance between explaining it so a patient will understand and not making it so simple that you miss something in the
right,
explanation,
right.
right? That's the tension that's there. And I think the tension's always there. But I, I feel, based on my experience, that a better job could be done helping me understand the terms, the words, all of the potential issues and questions that could come up that a patient may have.
Yeah, I went to the physio yesterday, physical therapist, as you call it in the US,
Yes.
from a sort of an acute injury. And there was a few things you've said today that rung true. Like I'm sitting there and she's interrogating me. I say that. She asked me questions. She was very nice, but she's sitting there typing madly on the keyboard as we're going, which is fine. I get the sense that she's listening to me. But at the end of the appointment, I had a piece of paper with some hand drawings, which were totally fine, saying, "Hey, Angus, you need to do this exercise. And if you're wanting to resume running, you've got to do this. And it's spring in Australia. I need to do a bunch of lawn mowing at the moment, cut the grass." And it's,
Yes.
yeah, you can do that, but you need to take short steps and so on. And I thought the potential for complexity there was actually quite high. And the better and more clearly I could understand her instructions, the better I, as a patient, would associate the work that they'd done. At the end of the day, she got me to move my leg in different places and test stuff and then figure out where it was sore. But it's that communication aspect was absolutely critical. She mentioned some parts of the body that I'd never heard of before, where the tendon joins the pelvis. Maybe you can write in, listeners, and tell us what that part's called. I'd never heard of it before, but it just struck me that because she could make that more simply, not only would I get a better outcome as a patient, but also I would think better of the practice. I'd go,
Yep.
oh, those guys are really good. And the reality is, whether she'd made that complex or simple, she'd still done her job medically. And yet, from a communication point of view and follow up, could be worlds apart. All right, Steve, we better move on to number 4, which is scale.
So, scale is how do you maintain that excitement when you first started? That startup mentality, that taking care of customers, that it creating new ways to do things. And the last principle is number 14 is believe it's always day one. And I
Mm,
really resonate with that a lot. And the background of that principle is Jeff Bezos was standing in front of an employee all hands meeting in Seattle, a couple thousand employees there. He did it every quarter just to update on where we are as a company and those kinds of things. At the end, he opens it up for questions, and he had them on note cards. And he looked down and the question was, Jeff, what does day two look like? And the reason is that he ended every one of his letters with some version of the phrase, it's still day one, it's always day one. Even in 2019, the letter, which looked back at 2020, the pandemic, even with all the problems we've had, it's still day one.
mm,
So when he looked at that, what does day two look like? He chuckled and said, day two is stasis, followed by irrelevance, followed by excruciating, painful decline, followed by death.
hmm,
And that's why it's always day one.
mm,
And part of what started this whole journey for me was looking at companies that had once been very successful, household names that are gone. What happened? And companies like Amazon that continue to be successful.
mm,
Why?
mm.
And if you look at those companies, you look at BlackBerry, easy one. iPhone came out, they cornered the business email market with their handheld device.
Yep,
Everybody had one.
yep.
And they didn't believe that anybody would type on a flat keyboard. They would on a piece of glass.
No.
Guess they were wrong,
Yeah,
right?
I didn't believe it. I remember when it came out and I thought, nah, no one's gonna do that. I
What?
had a BlackBerry.
Yeah, of course. And some people miss their BlackBerry, right? But what happened is consumers changed.
Mm,
And the big change was not just email, but internet. And BlackBerry said, the co-CEO said, you can't put internet on a mobile device. So they closed off that entire ability,
mm.
and then you could watch that slow decline. Again, as a practice, as a company, as a business, wherever you are, this idea of it's still day one, and how do we keep that excitement going and that focus on patients, customers, and clients?
Yeah, it's a great question. Wow. Day one for me, certainly, in one of my businesses is 10 years ago, maybe longer. And so just thinking back to what it was like, it would be like the first time that you're dealing with a client and how excited you are, and you want to make sure every part of the process is perfect and you're super attentive. And it's like, how could we do this better, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very easy for that to wear off over time, isn't it? And
Yes.
I'm sure it's the same for the listeners. It's like they remember when the first patient walked through the door and they wanted to make it amazing for them and everything was new. Maybe it wasn't perfect. You were still trying to get the printer to work or whatever, but just the same, it was, yeah, it's a really interesting principle. All right, Steve. Look, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I think the Bezos letters is a really interesting concept. This is available on Amazon. If people want to get in touch or learn more, what should they do?
The book's available on Amazon, as you might suspect, and the website for the book is thebezosletters.com. And I would say one of the things that I hope people do, and I tried to structure the book this way, is at the end of every chapter are a series of 2 or 3 questions, just to help you think about the principle and how it might apply and what you might have to change or adapt to your own particular situation. And then my primary social channel is LinkedIn. And if you look me up, Steve Anderson Insurance or Steve Anderson Bezos, connect with me. Let me know you listen to the podcast. I'd be glad to connect with you and engage there.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much for your time, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. We've covered a bit there, haven't we? There were 14 principles in the book and four broad business cycles. And my question, as I ask you every day, is what is one thing you can do as a result of what you've heard today? Make sure you go and do that before you go on to the next thing. Finally, if you got some value from today, I'd really appreciate it if you head to where you heard this show, leave us a lovely review to give us the encouragement to bring you more great content every week on Practice Growth HQ.